I'm here with Red Madden. Red Madden, welcome. What are some of the challenges that you see related to design most frequently in your classes?
I think design education is already challenging because you can't teach someone good design. You can only teach them the methodology for which to arrive at good design, right? So one of the things that I think is when I compare the generations of design students to when I was an undergrad, I think the patience is always a challenge for all generations of designers. But I think especially now in the world of automation, I think when you're doing, real professional design work, that it's not an Instagram filter, that it takes, there's a process, there's a cognition, and teaching students that most of that actually does not happen on the computer. That there is still, we've been, producing design for, millennia. And, the computer's only been a part of that for, 50 years. So teaching them that, the ideas are in your head and we got to get them out into the corporal physical world first. Before then, design just means plan, a plan of execution to meet a criterion of goals, right? So teaching them that and also teaching them iteration. I think I could write a whole book on the contemporary issues of the current design students with iteration, because we're all so scheduled to the brim. They have just enough time to come to class, to get some sleep, to go to their job, but they have not remembered to make time for design, to make time for iteration, rather than, like a math class where you need to get your homework done. You need to give yourself time to percolate, come back to the drawing table, percolate, and give yourself more than one solution. And I think that's because of the time and the, how higher ed is such a hybrid experience now too. Whereas I think that, to me, iteration, coming up with more than one idea is the most difficult practice, so you got to give them lots of time to understand the power of iteration.
Time. That reminds me of these amazing new AI platforms like Midjourney and Dolly. I've been dying to ask you about these because time and iterations seems to happen like magic, but at the same time, it's got some flaws. So maybe you can speak a little bit about the place, if there is a place, for Midjourney and Dolly and other AI image generation platforms in the work and in the field of design.
I think the biggest misconception with automation and even AI is that you can kind of set it and forget it. You remember that old commercial? Set it and forget it, and I think that's a dangerous place to play, because what makes design so beautiful is the humanity of it, right? Connecting groups of humans together, even data-driven creative. We need to look at data as humans. All those data points and metrics were made by a human behavior. So it's really important to keep that in mind when we are designing. And you need to have the hands on the wheel. A lot of automation is helpful. It can only speed up your work, but it can't do it for you. And I would say you need to be even more mindful and be able to check under the hood. For instance, when I'm teaching web design, students making their first web pages using the languages of HTML and CSS, for instance, those languages come together to make communications in a browser possible, right? But you've got to give yourself the time to be literate, because even though I make them do a hand-coded page, which will never happen because everything is templated, I want them to at least understand so that they can look under the hood of an automatic website template. They should be able to, like, so if they need to change and manipulate and customize a template, they can go into the code and do that. They never have to write from the ground up. But that literacy and that keeping watch, I think, is really going to be a very important career path for communication graduates. Because I know I will sleep better knowing that there's a communication scholar or director monitoring the AI, because we can't put the AI back, but it, to me, I call it a barrel of monkeys. Like, I really, because we're talking about iteration and real retention of knowledge, can we have a generation that has real knowledge if everything is being automatic for them? The answer is yes, but we're going to have to build a process where people are looking under the hood on a regular basis and not just kind of hitting the red button and letting it fly.
I like that metaphor of hitting the red button and letting it fly. I think it's perfect for where we are right now, especially with generative work and AI. Whenever you talk to students about how they might integrate these kinds of tools, whether it's generative AI with image making or generative AI with actually doing coding for you, or even a template that's already done for you, how do you negotiate that tension between what's done for us versus what we need to intervene with? Like, where do you draw that line of intervention for humans if we're moving to this world where a lot of things are done for us, we might not feel as inclined to check our math or to check under the hood?
If you choose to do that, I think your life is going to be incredibly boring. I think it's going to become very vanilla. I think that people will quickly get bored, because the pendulum of style in the humanities swings. I always use the example of modernism and postmodernism. When modernism began, you know, in the 30s in Europe, we think about Picasso's Guernica, we think about, Adolf Hitler's opposition to modernism and abstraction, right? And so, but that became the thing. And then here comes postmodernism. So modernism led to beautiful branding and logo type, pretty much making corporate America's system of identities, right? Well, by the time the 1970s come along, we have a whole new generation that is rejecting that, because now the beautiful, clean lines of modernism represent globalization and corporatization. So I think very similar things will happen where we will have this automatic stuff, we'll kind of blend it into our daily lives, but there's going to always be a craving for something handmade and unique and original, right? That is a human craving that never goes away. So I think the pendulum will swing, those things will fade, just like TikTok, for instance. It's like, yeah, that was fun for a while. What else is new? So I think that we just need to use AI now, maybe as a catalyst for original thought. If we can use AI and automation to help us come up with more ideas. So, for instance, if I'm doing research about what's out there, I might see designers that have come before me. I might even test to see what the automatic image maker might make. But in the end, that is just a basis of research to make my own original work. That's how I think is the best use. And most designers don't want to be automated. The whole joy in human experience of making and design and connecting word and image to create meaning for humans, that's just something that can't be replaced. That joy, I think it's kind of like when an actor first realizes he loves being on stage. It's a very similar feeling of, look at that, what I made. It made people happy. It connected a brand with a purpose, a cause, a public service announcement. I think that it won't overtake the human craving of design. I hope.
We can always hope.
We can
Absolutely.
always hope.
We can
Yes.
always hope, for sure. What are some common misunderstandings that students might bring or people might bring to design thinking?
I think they know more than they think they know. I think that I call it a practice of looking. We kind of go around the world in our routine, but if you can actually stop and be mindful of what you're seeing and consuming visually, you can actually start to really understand the world and create from those, from what you see in your own universe, right? Um, and so I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that if I learn Adobe, I'll be a good designer, right? If I could just find the perfect stock image, it's I often make the joke of like I see students that will spend hours on Google looking for the perfect image when they could go outside, and they forget they have a high powered tool in their pocket. When I was buying point and shoot, an 11 megapixel little camera was like $900. Well, now the megapixels in your pocket are more powerful than any Nikon SLR I would have bought to snap, and so I don't think they realize the power of the objects and visual information in their own lives that they can use. And that way being original is a moot point, because everything you're making, including the components of your composition, are your own, from your own heart, your own backyard, so to speak. And so I think they don't realize their power of making just by the tool in their pocket. You can do a lot of visual research just by capture, and creating what I call mood boards. So if I need to make something serious, I might just collect random images that evoke seriousness, and that helps fuel my visual mind to create a new message or visual communication with those things. And it also keeps us contemporary. If you use someone else's image that was shot for a completely different purpose, and you're kind of retrofitting it into your concept, to me, I think you waste a lot of time trying to make that thing fit when you could just shoot your own work, use elements from your daily environment rather than always seeking for it digitally.
You have a way to make design thinking more accessible for someone coming to the field brand new that could summarize and kind of help someone who's struggling to wrap their head around what is design thinking?
Well, I think it's very much a human activity. We don't see any other species in nature doing it. We don't, I know last time I checked, there wasn't like a ad agency run by gorillas. Well, that's another conversation. But we're the only ones in nature that want to understand how the world is put together, right? And how we can take it apart and refashion it. And I think, design thinking really does that. It's a lens that you look through at the world, where first and foremost, I think design thinking is always human centered. Design thinking is compositional. It means that you're always looking at the world to find balance and to find color, right? And to see that when good design is employed, there is universal happiness, right? And so design thinking is the belief that if I apply this to not just good work, but in your life, in your relationships, it can be quite beneficial, because it allows you to kind of organize behaviors and feelings just like you would organize elements on the page, whether that page is a digital page, a video page, or a canvas, right? So I feel like design thinking allows us to appreciate how all the elements in our universe are working together in a great design. I mean, just looking at the world, this little blue speck we live on, and how all of nature is working in unison. And that's design thinking. It's really embracing the natural beauty of design. And we see it in nature all the time. I mean, I know some people even think and refer to the great creator, the great designer, depending on what your belief structure is. But I would just say that nature itself does teach us a lot. Like, for instance, we talk about the golden ratio or the golden rectangle. The Greeks were using that. I mean, that comes from nature. So I think that design thinking gives us permission to really be in awe of shape and color and line in our life.
I'm wondering, like, I know we have principles like contrast, repetition, uh, alignment, positioning. What are some of the foundational principles that you might tackle in that first couple of weeks in your courses?
Well, my favorite one to actually employ, and so that we can recognize diversity, that we all don't see the same thing when we look at it, that we, as the human audiences, we are actually the final step in any design, communication design, visual communication. And first, let me just say that's kind of the major differences between fine art, which is studio art, which is solving aesthetic problems, right? And usually the studio artist is making an expression of the world, and the audience will find that and connect with it. With design, same elements, a lot of same creative processes, except we began the process identifying the audience that this is going to be made for. So there's a strategic component. And so one of the first things that I like to do to teach students about perspective and gestalt and foreground and background. So gestalt is basically the German psychological understanding of design, that your preconceived identity, where you're from, your religious, your background, when you come up to something, have you ever seen one of those where if you look at it one way, it's a young woman, but if you look at it another way, it's like an older woman, and it's in black and white. And so I usually like to start the conversation of contrast, foreground, background, and gestalt, perspective, and our relationships with the objects, to start this principle of perspective and understanding, how you see it, right? And again, that's just an image. So then I also then move into, what if we added typography to this composition? Would that lead the audience to a different solution in what they saw? So I think starting with gestalt and that kind of fun activity, we begin to discuss the differences between pure aesthetics and communication design, which is bringing word and image together. Because images, like when you go to an art gallery, again, the human kind of finishes the whole composition of the artist's intent. Whereas in design, we start with the audience. We get to know them, we get to love them, and we want to make sure that we are producing for them. And so that kind of yields in having that conversation, kind of the difference between art for art's sake and strategic visual communication.
That's a huge difference, isn't it? Starting with a starting place of an audience just changes the entire conversation, doesn't it? I wonder, I know that you're very fond of Adobe tools. What other kinds of things do you love to use to do the actual work that you do?
Wow, you're absolutely right. I drank the Adobe Kool-Aid. Again, like I said, my background, I had a graphic designing mom. So, I didn't even use Microsoft Word until I became an undergrad, because in my house, we had Quark Express, Mac, and Adobe. So I was writing like eighth grade research papers in Quark Express. Didn't know that you could just have work on a page. So yeah, so I've been using Adobe forever. And what's really interesting about my love story with Adobe is that they wouldn't have known me from, a tree on the side of the road, because I just been using and teaching, and it is the industry standard for my profession, which I worked for 10 years as an agency creative before becoming in higher ed. So I don't have a lot of other tools, but I will say this: I am very, very much always seeking new mobile tools, because I think, again, as I talk about that powerful tool that my students carry in their back pocket, and speaking about iteration, it starts with the first steps of understanding the problem, understanding the ask of the assignment. And so I'm always looking for new tools that And I hate to say this, most of them are Adobe still, but like Adobe Capture, for instance. I know there's other tools out there that, allow you again to pick up ideas from your environment, for instance, and be able to organize those into reason and meaning. Kind of, you have to have lateral thinking and I'm sorry, lateral reasoning, literal thinking, because when you're going kind of trying to get to a deadline in a step-by-step process, but you still need to be able to think laterally and look at the universe. I kind of attribute it to like walking a dog on the beach. You're trying to get from point A to point B, but he's like sniffing the air and getting in the mud and absorbing the world around him. That's kind of what it's like to be a designer, right? So I'm really looking for those new tools that are free, because I think if we think about the students that are coming up and that are going to be college students in the next 10 to 20 years, they're coming from high schools and from open source freeware. And we need to embrace that and identify that and help them transition. Because I think when you are a young student, and you're doing things for self joy, maybe not even homework, we should not disregard those things, even though we want to transition them into a professional workspace where the industry is more typical. But here's the good news. For instance, video editing. Once you understand the timeline and nonlinear editing and editing, in time and space, whether you started that on Movie Maker or iMovie, when you get to my classroom, once you learn Premiere or, starting with Rush even, Premiere Pro is going to come to you. It's only going to add robustness to your work. Adobe's hard to beat. Adobe is hard to beat. And, like any big corporations, they're not perfect. There's a lot of new little technologies that are happening around them. And I think we need to let those things flow for sure, and embrace those things, but make the distinction of, if you're doing a broadcast commercial, you probably shouldn't do it on iMovie. You probably should do it in a professional framework that can be used in broadcast network, for instance.
Going back to the example of web design, I'm creating a website for a public audience, and I'm looking for criteria to know that I've created it in a way that will be the best way possible. And in my mind, I'm thinking clarity, things like prioritizing ideas, a hierarchy of items. I'm thinking about header one, header two. What are some of the criteria that you have in your head whenever you're looking at web design, and what makes web design good or bad according to that kind of criteria?
Well, when you become a designer like me, first of all, you got to understand that 85% of what's out there is not good design. But people will pay a lot of money just because of maybe they just don't understand the difference. You understand it when you see it, but yeah, how do you build it moving forward? The most important step that's always been around with web design is Photoshop. I cannot tell you, much like I would if you were doing a print composition, you know, never underestimate the power of putting pencil to paper. You know, web is a very gridded space. If you can remember Web 1.0, when we first got the internet, it was basically, we called them, digital brochures, very one-way street. You could go to a website and there was an image, and we used tables, right? So tabular design. So just rows and columns, very static, very structured. Then we got into Web 2.0, which is when we got cascading style sheets, which kind of freed us from tables and allowed us to kind of float things on a layout just like you would for print. So I can't tell you how important it is that you don't just think about it, you get it out of here onto, again, a physical piece of paper. Never underestimate, again, the golden mean, and just making a rectangle on a piece of paper and start to organize the layout in a wireframe. That's very, very important. And once you kind of sketch it out, it's kind of like if you put together a jigsaw puzzle, but I didn't give you the cover to the box. And I'd be like, well, you've done it a million times, but every single new job you need to start pencil to paper. That will never change. I don't care if we're in 2030 and we're all droids. You still got to you still got to get it out of here, because if it's in here, it's just a dream, an idea. You can't begin developing and realizing a concept until you get it out of your head and onto paper and you can share it, right? Creative process is like being a mad scientist. It's like the scientific method where you have a hypothesis, right? But you got to write that hypothesis down. And a lot of time it's just regurgitating what the ask is. I'm going to be making, the power of getting it out of your head into another medium, like on paper, which, by the way, doesn't require electricity. We all know how to use a tablet and a pencil, right? So those things are really important, because you've got to, in order to achieve visual hierarchy, you've got to know the space in which you're navigating. So focal point, what's the absolute number one thing that they should walk away from? Understanding hierarchy means setting those goals. Focal point, what's the first thing that's going to draw their eye in, and then lead them into the deeper information you want them. We talk about F layouts and Z layouts. So, and we have people that may not even be aware that they are Z layout people versus F layout people. I think Z layouts work out the best, because I do know that in good design, groupings of 3 about all people can handle. So if you start grouping, like if you have 12, 16 groupings, it becomes overwhelming and very busy. But I like, again, working in the Trinity, the magic number 3, where you have you have the main navigation, main content, then you have some smaller ones, and then the footer. 3 sections, start with 3 sections. And that's a perfect Z layout. But if you don't sketch it out on paper first, you can't even identify what needs to come first, second, or third. And that's the biggest misconception, because really the perfect process, the perfect web designer will sketch it out first on paper. Then they will move into Photoshop and they will do a static design. Because here's the thing people forget: in web, every element, your images, your text, your graphics, have to be at exact pixel width. It's not like print where you can like kind of shrink an image and make it work. In web design, if you put a space that's for a 300 by 300 image, that's exactly how big that image needs to be. And so the reason why we set it up in Photoshop first is so that we can inform ourselves how big each element needs to be. Because Photoshop for web, it has always been, even in Web 1.0 back in the 90s, we would always start with that static layout, so that if you were passing it on to coders, they would know exactly what they were coding. And you could also, give them the colors, the sizes, and all that. So it's real important, especially in web design that works at exact pixel widths and dimensions, to do that stuff first, so that you can tell yourself, you can't do that if I just hand you a box of puzzle pieces.
That's so true. That's so true. I imagine there's so many benefits to good design that we could go into beyond just web design, obviously. And how can we define how people are benefiting from our work in concrete terms? So we have kind of the rubric in our head, or the evaluation, or the criteria of what makes it look good. But to flip that over and to say, well, wait a second, how is this helping humanity? How is this helping people? Because I know I have benefited greatly from design research and theory in practice. So what are some of those concrete benefits?
Well, I should probably start with a little disclaimer that, these very powerful human tools and human persuasion, persuasion very well, there are people using these same things to spread bad things. So, for instance, good design can persuade you to love the environment, or it can persuade you to buy more guns. It's just, I think good design, the whole point, its power is, again, using what has been naturally good design in our environment and persuading humans to act in a certain way. So like if we're doing advertisement, There should always be a call to action, but you could advertise just as good things as bad things. But I think the best human benefit is that everyone can participate in it. I think 30 years ago, design was very exclusive to the people that were doing it for a living. The most beautiful thing about design, and I think why we have been able to manage through, war and disease, is because there is a place for everyone to design. I have always had a ratatouille approach because, again, I will be honest with you, I come from a very, very strict design education and structure that, if you weren't working for a studio, then you weren't successful. But I think that's completely changed because with this new generation having a gig economy, design is something you can do. You don't even have to do it full time. And you can do it for self gratification, just like if you're on Instagram, you're designing. If you're adding and customizing an image, if you're sharing things on LinkedIn, we need to never separate the power of the word and how we put together word and image to create really powerful meaning. You can do a whole study of political advertisements for the last 5 decades, for instance, and see how visual communication is used to persuade behaviors, which we know it's very hard to change a human behavior. You can persuade people to take incremental steps, but that to me is the benefit, is that it's no longer a gated community that only people that do it for a living can access. Anyone can pick up free tools, not just Adobe, but there's all kinds of open source things that you can do, but you could do something like Adobe Express, which is free to everybody. And to me, I think that's why I'm very in sync with Adobe, because they are very much aware that when you give people creative design tools, you can get a lot off your chest by making, so rather than, pick up a gun, pick up Adobe Express and tell us how you're feeling, rather than tell us in a different way, right? So that's my hope, is that design benefits us all because it gives us an outlet to express our emotions.
I love that you ended with emotions, because that emotional resonance is often what sticks with us. What advice would you give someone just starting out? What advice would you give someone who is brand new to design, who's just like, I don't know where to start, Red? Where do I start with this design thing? This seems confusing. This seems intimidating. This seems like there's all this like elitism in it, and I am intimidated. Tell me where I would start with trying to get into design or wrap my head around design as a student or someone who just wants to become an enthusiast.
Well, you have to start by employing a routine practice of looking, right? The best place you can start is if something catches your eye for whatever reason, start there. Why did it catch your eye? What was it that drew you in? And then try to recreate that experience in your own way, whether that be through drawing or a video, or even just making plain shapes on a digital canvas to try to evoke. Was it the color? Was it the shape? Was it that it was super thin or super thick? Or, did it have a word? And was that word fashioned with a font that was expressive, or was it in the text itself? There's so much that we can just capture and dissect and then try to build and recreate again. Because you're right, it is about emotion. Generally, when I get a creative brief, when I was a professional, that's a very description that you would follow. It's like, we want them to feel a certain way. We want them to, tap into certain emotions. And so that's where you start. You start defining your own emotions. Why did I react that way? And then try to recreate that same feeling in your own work. The tools are there. You don't have to pirate any software like we used to in the 90s. You can actually find, even just doodling, you know, just collect and document the world you live in through a regular practice of looking, mindful looking, not just kind of walking around, but what makes your head come up? What makes you look twice at something and then start to unpack that?
Do you keep a journal or a collection of things? I imagine most designers do, right? They have a collection of things that made them feel something that made whenever you practice looking, you probably notice some things pop up like themes of things that move you. Do you have any kind of thematic collections?
I definitely think that when I was in grad school, there was a lot, because I will say that studying design at the undergraduate level was one thing, but studying it at the graduate level was like almost religious experience because, really pushing design beyond the usual suspects. And what you begin to realize in if you are attaching yourself to this religion called design thinking, um, you really start to see the world differently, and you can see it in all of its forms, as it is and as it could be. Um, and that's just, the world around you are the themes and subjects. And so when I was an undergrad, I think I did a lot more journaling. Now I do a lot more kind of like a doctor, note to self. And so, because that's the other skill that I think is so cool, is that a lot of what we do is we take a verbal communication and we convert it into a visual communication. So the power of writing your words and your intentions for a job or a work or a composition, whether that be for school, for money, or for just self-fulfillment, putting it down in words is still so powerful. And so I think my journals were much more sketch noting, and now they're much more like me really expressing, verbalizing what I'm seeing visually. And that way it's easy to go back and forth, because that's what we do in communication design is we take the verbal and we create a visual.
So that assimilation of design vocabularies informed not only what you were doing then, but what you're doing now, and it informed it in a way of you're able to see new things with those new vocabularies. So essentially, I'm thinking like as a practitioner and as someone who went to grad school for design, that design thinking, that design vocabulary, it goes both ways, is what you're saying. The
Yeah,
visual informs the language, and the language informs the visual. So someone like
100%.
you could get way more out of these new tools that are AI generated. Can come back to that, right? Because you know what words to put in the prompt to get what you want out of the machine. And the
That's
better
true.
those tools come, the more like mature those tools become, the more like the value of that education comes back to make it more useful for someone like you to apply.
Well, and again, there are different schools of thought too, that design should be universal, completely open, you know, which is a very progressive thought, to think that no one owns anything. It's kind of like, it'd be nice if we didn't have any borders. Um, so I don't know how long it will take for us to shake off this attribution. It's a whole thing of being a maker or a creator is proprietary work. And that, that's the only way a creative person can make a living, is by being able to own it and sell their work. Um, and much like many automatic and automation has affected many industries, you know, will it continue to affect the advertising industry, the marketing industry, other creative industries that employ designers? Or will we find new ways of creating revenue? Like maybe some designers will actually be working for these automatic systems, like I said, in translating, if someone puts this in. I think it really began when I started really understanding search engine optimization in web design, because that's kind of the same thing. How do I get people to my site? Well, you write key rich searchable words, right? You put those in your H1, there's all kinds of verbal strategies in strategic visual communication to make you findable, visible, because if no one sees the work, then the communication can't grow or live. And so I think that what will I do with these new technologies? I don't know. I might completely steer clear of and continue to fight the fight of, human derived composition. but like I said, I think that we welcome these new technologies. We use them if we can, and if we don't, we just move on.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about the similarities between SEO, because that is writing for a machine, and these new technologies, right? So I wonder if maybe you could give us a little bit more about strategies that you've found that have been useful for SEO specifically, and getting found and getting that attention, whether visually or verbally.
Well, there's two kinds of ways that you can stuff your content to be more findable. And first of all, let me distinguish, search engine optimization are things that the designer can do to organically and naturally, come up higher on the list in a search, right? Now, SEM, search engine marketing, that's where I would actually buy it. Like I would buy a word. Like if I was a pizza joint, I might, buy the word pizza for 30 days, right? That's different. So that I'm guaranteed within that 30 days, I will come up. So what really works first is to start with, the head of your website, so if you know anything about code, you have a head, a body, and a footer. And that's, so if you can think about your website like a human with anatomy, your head is where there's not a lot of visual, but that's where all the thinking part of the website lives. So there's a lot of meta that we can put in a head tag. For instance, geolocation. People forget to put their longitude and latitude. So with the example of having like a pizzeria, if someone's traveling through San Antonio and I've put geolocations, well, now when they search pizza, I'm going to come up first because I'm the closest geographically to them when they search. That's a great strategy that people often forget. Your most important searchable words, writing good headlines. I had a friend that's all they did was just write headlines. And because what goes in your H1 tag when a human searches, that's what the web crawler is looking for. It's going to look for H1 tags first, right? To see if they can find that word in a header, because that's typically going to give that person's what they're looking for. So making sure that you're writing really good titles in your H1 tag, 5 words or less. And then, of course, in your paragraph tag, as you begin to write paragraphs and more long form, to do it naturally, but when you are outlining your work, because again, outline it out in Microsoft Word or outline it on paper, but say like, these are the key search words. And there's lots of resources that will tell you, what are the hot words this week, or when it comes to pizza, what, put the most important 10 words, and make sure that you incorporate those into your writing. And alt tags. People, for the love of our brothers and sisters out there, millions of people that are using screen readers, you've got to put text behind your images, because guess what? That's also searchable. So if someone said, I want an image of a pizza, and you didn't put any alt tags, your image is invisible to the search. So anytime you can put live text, that is what's going to hook search engines to find you. That was a lot.
I love it. I love it. It's so, and now I'm thinking, okay, the other side of the coin, right, in getting found and getting attention is social media. So I wanted to just kind of ask, how can design thinking, how can this school of thought help us in getting found on social media? And what are some of the things that are top of mind that we should remember before we hit that post button?
Well, first and foremost, social media, and we call it, public relations, which of course is also a very important discipline and major in our department. Um, we call it the digital diamond, right? You need to think of social media as someone you're almost paying, even though I know it seems free, but you are paying them with access to your identity and your audience. Social media are drivers to your website. The biggest mistake that especially new graduates make is they make their social media their website. And that is a huge faux pas. Because you don't own any of the data. So you can't, I mean, you could pay Facebook or Instagram to tell you who's coming, but guess what? You're going to have to pay them to tell you who's visiting your content. That to me is a little fascist. So the only benefit of social media is to give people carrots to drive to your website. And students are graduating, and if you talk to any career recruiters, human resource experts, social media can actually tarnish you and you don't own any of the data. So the first and foremost is use social media as a bookmark to your website. Put things out there that say, want to know more? Come over to my website, because then you can actually build a community, and everyone that hits your website, guess what? You own the data because you've paid to host that website. It's like paying rent. When you have a registered domain, you have a slot versus, going over to Instagram or Facebook or, God forbid, TikTok.
Okay, I want to
you
dig
know,
into that.
oh,
Tell me more about this hierarchy of social media that you have in your mind.
well, um, well, first of all, security and privacy, we thought, at least, because you couldn't tell by the behaviors of the mass public, but that was very important to them. When TikTok came out pre-pandemic, um, those of us in technology were like, oh my gosh, like the IP is like, you might as well dress naked in front of China. Or, I mean, there's just they had full reign of all of your information, your user, your audience. I mean, I almost think, and again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist per se, but this was a tool that was meant to infiltrate Western culture and gather info. How they're using that info, I don't know. I could make theories all day long, but all I'm saying is it's very easy for them. It's one of the, and so when people were going crazy for it, the same people that are like privacy, privacy, I was just like, whoa, like that just goes to tell you that you really don't understand the technology. And they've done such a great job in the design. They made it user friendly, they made it fun. That's what good design can do. Like it can really create a whole culture around it, right? Until you realize it might not be good for you, right? So that is the one that, I was not surprised that, public universities like our own have banned it from all devices, because it is quite infiltrating. I mean, it's just the plain fact of it. I don't see nearly as much harm with Instagram. Never really was into Snapchat. I think it's kind of fizzled out a little bit. Twitter, well, it was one of my favorites, but not anymore. Boy, if I had $1 million, that is not how I would spend it. So really, to me, what's left is people need to jump on the automated web train, because having your own website is the most proprietary digital identity you can have. And you can control the narrative. Cannot control the narrative of your own identity or self-promotion on social media channels.
We see a lot of people saying, you've got to post 3 to 4 times a day to social media. You've got to do this and this. You've got to make sure you have a good hook, a good body, and a good call to action. What are some of the things on the top of your mind that are most effective on some of these platforms that we like?
Well, you're right. Frequency and consistency is a huge factor in social media. We know this. Um, if you're just occasionally posting, like my mom, she's retired. She's not trying to change the world by posting occasionally. No harm, no foul. But if you're actually claiming to have a social media strategy or campaign, yes, there are very important things. Or if you're the social media manager, you're running the Facebook or Insta or Twitter feed for a company or a brand, you do have to be frequent. Like most audiences today, and I'm thinking, iGen and Gen Z now, if there's not, new content at least twice a day, they consider that a dead channel, and you can lose audiences. I don't think you'll lose them significantly, but you certainly won't acquire new either. So you could quickly begin to fizzle out your channel if you're not being proactive. What a lot of people don't realize is, much like a advertising campaign, a social media strategy needs a plan that's attached to time and content, right? So we have a lot of tools now like Hootsuite and other, where you actually compose all of your daily posts for the month, ahead of time. That way you can gauge and track, and so there is a bigger strategy involved in a real social media campaign that is meant to drive, and you can identify what that objective is. It's to drive more traffic to the website. It's to get more clicks on a certain product or service. Or if you're a nonprofit, it's to increase donations or volunteers, So I think those are real important. Yes, you need to have a hook. Now, when I talk about hook and angles, I'm talking more like digital publications. So for those of us that are creating, EPUBs and online magazines, and you're really employing good journalistic writing absolutely requires those, strong visuals. You got to have a nice headline and a hook that says, 3 lines that want me to make me read it. Or if it's the cover story, pull quotes, things like that. Like if I was writing a full version story, I would probably just put a pull quote on social media and say, you want to know where this happened? Read more here, and then drive them to the magazine. It's things like that, that social media should have always been a stepping stone into your personal proprietary web identity. That's kind of in a perfect world, that's how it would have gone. And it's even worse when I see a business will make their Facebook page their actual website. Like I cannot even fathom that, because if I was a business with revenue and overhead, I would want to know exactly the price points and where I'm hitting people. In what places am I connecting? It has totally changed marketing and advertising forever. Which of course, advertising and marketing are one of the largest industries to employ creative people or design professionals.
I often see students might have more than one account. And that can be good, right? Like one of them is kind of like a dating account, right? And one of them is maybe a business account. And they might treat these as with different rules, right? Can you maybe talk more about the business side and how they might differentiate their business from other businesses to get that attention that is needed to fulfill their bottom lines? And this will be useful for all of our social media manager students too, because we have a lot of students who are
Yeah.
planning to be social media managers too.
Well, for those out there who are planning on being a social media managers, first of all, I will tell you, no digital agency is going to take you seriously if you're not Google Analytics certified. If you do not have that certification on your resume, do not apply for a social media manager job. They will not take you seriously. If you're serious about social media management, you got to know how to run that Google Analytics dashboard. To start, you might go into a position where they're using a proprietary dashboard. even the Adobe for advertising is a huge, robust kind of agency in a box. So that's first and foremost. If you're serious about social media management, you've got to understand analytics. You got to understand tracking and A/B testing, because it happens in real time, all that testing and throwing out. So you've got to, they're creating new technologies that allow you to see your tracking and all your creative assets so that you can literally switch in real time if you're seeing things trending up or down, right? So that's one tool if you're going to actually be a social media manager. Have their own website. I cannot tell you that enough. Do not use your social media channels as your main contact vehicle. Because here's what's going to happen. All recruiters now are checking your social media pages. So they're looking to see, and they're seeking those because they want to know the real you, right? Not the one you interview. Because we all know we send our representative of our real us when we're first interviewing. So clean up your social media. Now, for many years, even myself, I had 2 Facebook pages. One was for my personal family, because as you know, you don't pick your family. You're born into your family. You got all kinds of people in your family. You don't necessarily want your work people mingling with your family people. And I did that for almost a decade when Facebook first came out. And so I think keeping it separate is real important. So my Red Madden page, which really focuses mostly on, my career and education and so forth. But hands down, that example never worked, because let me tell you what's most important is your LinkedIn page. Your LinkedIn page should absolutely be the social media channel of your career. So if you could personify your career, you want to nurture that career, you want to keep it safe, you want to keep it elevated, you want to keep it growing, right? So we don't put, Kegger Party 98 on our LinkedIn page. Okay, that's really, really important to understand. So I would hope that as people graduate, they actually fizzle out. Like, I think having an Instagram page is fun because you can just show where you are. Just be careful. You don't need to always tell people that you're not at home. Just, but really linked your LinkedIn page, sharing articles, sharing professional insights, being part of different learning communities on LinkedIn Learning, which, by the way, is absolutely free for all Roadrunners. You want to get certified for free? Go to the Career Center, click on LinkedIn Learning. There's cert programs while you're still a student. Get those on your resume. But I would think when you graduate, that's all you need. Your Instagram to share fun and life, and make sure it's not called Hooter Girl 69. Make sure that it's something reputable so that when they're looking at you, you're like, oh, good, she's got a family life, but it's minimal. Here's the other clue. You don't have to share everything on social media. Share a picture and say, I had a great time. Call it a day. You don't need to, share that much. But so if you're going to have separate accounts, to me, having the LinkedIn to keep your career nurtured, having your Instagram to keep your family and social life nurtured, and then have a website where you drive everyone to your contact form, and they contact you through your website, not through your DMs on social.
It's easy to forget that can just disappear, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's completely effervescent almost. It's could very easily disappear. I had a friend who had a huge following on Twitter years ago, and it just disappeared overnight, and it was the most frustrating thing. And those kind of cautionary tales are not rare,
And you
unfortunately.
can't recapture that because you don't own it. That won't
It,
happen on your website because you can keep track of every user that comes to your website, especially because I teach WordPress in the senior capstone. And, the classes previous to that are just kind of hypothetical. But when you get in that one, we get you a real domain where you actually now have your own piece of cyberspace. and that's where you want to drive people, because that can never go away unless you don't pay your hosting bill, which is only about, $9 a month.
Mhm. So,
So I think that's a pretty low cost to
yes.
own my own content.
So that sounds like a great specific action step that everyone can take today is to get something that you can own. What is another specific action step, this time more specifically to design thinking? Is it looking? Would you say that's the one place that people should start? Should they start with looking or maybe something else?
I definitely think start with looking and history. I cannot tell you the joy I find when I see a student who's kind of created something, and then I go, oh, that looks like something from 1905, and they don't even realize that they have picked up a historical mannerism in their style of design. And so, you know go pick up a design history book. Philip Meggs, who has been kind of the I hate to call him a monopoly, but he's pretty much the godfather of all graphic design history books. And he's got some really, really good ones. There's actually one just called The History of Graphic Design, and it will inform you the evolution, which, by the way, again, the computer is at the very end of the 20th century. You begin to understand that these human design styles and mannerisms still are almost hereditary in new generations of designers. And so, if you're not into sketching or journaling or capturing the world around you, those are all very good. But you can also do the same thing by opening up a graphic design history book and trying to recreate some of those works. Because what's really interesting, it wasn't until the 20th century that fine art and communication design or graphic design began to split, with fine art remaining in the studio. But you must remember that before, the proliferation of the printing press, and then, of course, the computer, fine art and design were bedfellows working, because if you were to do an advertisement poster, you had to paint it. It was a painting. If you were doing a billboard, it was a paint, so it wasn't until these new kind of output technologies really kind of separated fine art from graphic design. And it's really interesting because for many, many years, even in my own education, my fine art studio peers, we all took the same classes until about the last 30 hours, where they went and continued painting or printmaking, or fine art photography. I think it's really interesting we call it fine art photography because it's the old way of making, right? It's like even printmaking, that used to be the mass way of printing, but now it's a fine art studio. So as these new technologies, that kind of widens the gap between, studio art and communication design or graphic design, which is more rapid and current. But those are, look at the history books. Some of your most, you might have seen some of these posters like from the postmodern period from Pushpin, and you might go, oh my gosh. And so be inspired by what came before you and be aware of it, because design has history and it has emotion to that history.
Wonderful. Red, where can people find you online?
Ooh, just about everywhere. I'm definitely on LinkedIn, so you can absolutely find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me on Instagram for sure. And you can always just go to UTSA and search Red Madden. I'm sure you'll find me there too. But I'm always delighted to have this conversation with anyone who was wanting to engage, because I do think that good design can make us actual better people. We behave better when we are surrounded with beauty and good design. Don't believe me? Compare Penn Station to Grand Central.
I
But
love
so
that.
that's my hope, is that, good design makes us more in touch with our humanity.
And I love how accessible you make yourself to help people find you, especially given this conversation about how it can add to our humanity. Red, thank you so much for joining us. We
Well, thank
appreciate
you
it.
so much for having me. I'm very grateful to have this conversation with you today, Ryan. Really appreciate it.